Great, thank you very much. So we've heard a lot over the last day or so about the tremendous amount of ecosystem change that has occurred in Lake Huron, in particular over the last 20 years. And of course, what we've come to learn is that a lot of these changes have been caused by and are certainly very closely associated with the invasion and establishment of dry-sended mussels, in particular quagga mussels, which we know now, they can be found in most parts of the lake. And so as we've been hearing, dry-sended mussels have really affected the food web from the base of the food web all the way up to the top. So we see declining nutrient levels, reductions in phytoplankton biovolume, we see reduced zooplankton biomass and changes in zooplankton community composition. We've seen pretty much the near loss of Diaparia, a benthic amphipod, and we've seen declines in prey fish populations. And so, these various changes have impacted lake whitefish, as I feel like most people have come to know and appreciate. And in particular, the loss of Diaparia has been important to whitefish because this was an important source of food. And as well, what I'll be speaking quite a bit about today is the decline in zooplankton, which raises concerns about whether larval lake whitefish are getting enough food to eat. So these ecosystem changes have basically had really direct impacts on multiple life stages of lake whitefish. And for my talk today, I'm not going to be able to talk about all of the various changes or some of the hypotheses out there about how lake whitefish are being impacted. So I'm just going to touch on some of the main ones. But after dry-sended mussels came into the system, we really started to see changes such as declines in growth and condition, and these were being noted in kind of later stage juveniles and in adults. And the reason we were seeing these changes, I think, at these life stages was because these are the fish that are caught in our monitoring nets and in our commercial fisheries. So some of the changes, of course, also include a change in diet, and I'm going to speak more about that in a moment. We've seen changes in the isotopic niche of lake whitefish, so kind of where in the environment they're deriving their energy from. There's been changes in depth distribution as well, and of course what we've been hearing about are the declines in population abundance. So this slide just gives an example of some of the changes that we've seen in the diet of lake whitefish. So this is work conducted by a graduate student. She's actually just finished her master's. This is Courtney Taylor. And this is part of the project that Ryan was speaking about earlier that's been funded by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. And for this work, Courtney looked at the diet of lake whitefish, getting used to the microphone, the diet of lake whitefish in different parts of Lake Huron. And this is from stomach contents that have been collected over the years by the ministry, and also some stomach samples from Saugeen and Ojibwe Nation. And so what Courtney found was that there's really stark differences across the lake in terms of what, and this is mainly adults, what adult lake whitefish are feeding on. And so this is showing changes through time from 2006 to 2019 in the diet composition of these whitefish for the central main basin and for the southern main basin. And so you can see that fish in the central main basin, we see this increase in round gobies in the diet. So now most of the diet of lake whitefish in the central main basin is round gobies. So quite a large change. And then we see a very different pattern in the southern main basin where most of the diet is now made up of dry-sended mussels. So huge changes. There's also been changes in what we call the isotopic niche of lake whitefish. So as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of where in the environment lake whitefish are getting their energy from. And so this is a study where we had scale samples in South Bay in Lake Huron dating back to the 1940s. And we used these scale samples to measure nitrogen and carbon in various fish in the community. And this was to look at whether, so basically nitrogen is an indicator of trophic level, and carbon tells you whether the fish are sort of feeding in more nearshore or offshore areas. And so a couple of take-home messages here is that So we looked at different time periods in this data set, and what we found was that most of the changes in the fish community actually happened in the most recent time period. So we had really long-term stability in this food web until that 2000 to 2017 time period. You can see there's different fish species shown here. So we have lake whitefish, or the LW, there's lake trout, there's smallmouth bass, rainbow smelt in there, cisco, lake trout, a number of different species. And what we found is this is showing kind of the midpoint, the centroid of these isotopic niches. And so what we see is that lake whitefish showed more change than any other fish in this time series. So it seems like lake whitefish are kind of being maybe disproportionately affected from sort of some of the recent invaders like dry-sided mussels than the other fish species. Okay, so we saw these changes in kind of these older juveniles and adults, and I would say it was really only more recently that we began to really understand that a lot of the declines in the population abundance were being driven by declines in recruitment. And what we mean here is just basically a decline in the number of fish surviving that juvenile life stage and becoming adults. And we've seen a number of indicators that recruitment has declined. And Taylor Brown's going to be speaking a little bit later about recruitment changes as well. But in a nutshell, we have sort of indicators from both our fishery-dependent information. So we have statistical catch-at-age models, and we look at samples from the commercial fishery. And then also we have monitoring surveys that are ongoing. And these have shown that there's been a decline in the numbers of young fish in the population. So ages sort of about 1 to 4 years old. We've seen increases in the mean age of fish in our nets, indicating that sort of the population is aging and we don't have kind of younger recruits coming into the population. And then we've seen, for example, also a decline in the number of age 4 fish produced per individual spawner, and this is coming from our statistical catch-at-age models. So to better understand these declines in recruitment, we sort of turned our attention to the larval fish stage. This is work basically to look at whether processes affecting the larval stage are contributing to the declines in recruitment that we were seeing. So the declines in kind of age 4 fish. We had a bit of a black box and didn't really know what was going on in these earlier life stages. So kind of the two main hypotheses that we've been exploring with this work include that reduced food availability caused by the filter feeding effects of dry-sided mussels, reducing the amount of zooplankton prey for our larval fish, but this is contributing to slower growth and poor survival of these larval lake whitefish. And the second hypothesis that we've been looking at with this work is whether there's been sort of a loss or disruption of the spring plankton bloom, which has also been attributed to the filter feeding effects of dry-sided mussels, but could also be affected by climate change. Whether this disruption of the spring plankton bloom is contributing to a mismatch between larval fish, so when they're hatching and when they're out there needing to find food, and whether there's enough zooplankton prey available to them. So we've been conducting larval fish surveys, and this is work done in collaboration with the Upper Great Lakes Management Unit, and also more recently we've been working with Fathom 5 National Marine Park, and this is part of the project that Ryan Lozon mentioned earlier, the Together with Gigoyak project, where we're looking at a number of different aspects of whitefish ecology. And for this work, basically what we're doing is we're going out in the spring as early as we can and sampling repeatedly throughout the week and continuing that on until our larval fish catches basically drop to 0. So we're really trying to look at that full larval fish period. And so these are just very simply like larval tows done with these small vessels just below the surface, and we follow up these larval fish tows also with some plankton tows as well. And so we've been doing this work at a number of different sites around Lake Huron. So we have been sampling most consistently in the fishing islands in the Central Main Basin. And fortunately in this area we actually have historical data from the 70s and 80s from before dry-sanded mussels were in the system, so it allows us that temporal comparison. We've also been doing work, and this is with our Parks Canada colleagues, in Fathom 5 National Marine Park off Tobermory, up here. And then we've been doing sampling in Blind River in the North Channel and in Nottawasaga Bay in southern Georgian Bay. So a lot of our sampling has focused on the fishing islands, and I just wanted to say a few words about this area. So it's actually not just like one individual spawning shoal, it's actually a complex of a number of different spawning shoals that are sort of connected across this broad area. So you can see it spans about 44 kilometers, kind of in a straight line. And the shores of this area are within the traditional territory of Saugeen and Ojibwe Nation. And this has been historically a very important spawning region and also for fishing as well. And this is one of the areas where we've seen substantial declines in population abundance, harvest, and recruitment. And you know, I've listened to some stories about just how plentiful spawning populations used to be in this area, and just how much that's declined over the years. And you can see just a graph down in the right-hand corner there, just showing estimates of sort of recruits per individual spawner fish, and you can see in recent years it's basically zero. And so this spawning shoal complex, you can see here, this is just showing our larval fish catches for this area in 2022. So these are whitefish, just to give you a sense of like how long this area is and just how widely distributed the larval fish are in this area. Okay, so basically now I'm going to move into just sharing some of the findings of this work. So this is focused on the fishing islands area, and this is showing larval lake whitefish densities through time in that historical time period, so the 70s and 80s, before dry-sanded mussels were in the system, and more recently. And what you can see is that basically the numbers of larval lake whitefish have declined by 75%, so quite a substantial drop. And what's interesting to note here is that in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't just that we had more spawning fish. In fact, this was before the population really started to take off and reach its peak in the 2000s. So spawning stock biomass was actually really low in the 70s and 80s. And yet you can see that there were still good numbers of larval fish being produced during that time period. Now, these reductions in larval fish that we're seeing now could be because maybe less fish are actually being hatched. So that's one thing, maybe something's happening to embryos, or there's, like I said, maybe fewer adults. But it could also just be due to the fact that maybe these fish are some of them are dying before we're actually getting the chance to sample them. So the other trend that we've seen is we've seen an overall reduction in growth rates of our larval fish between these two time periods. So this is just looking at the size of our larval fish by day of the year, and you can see that by the end of the growing season currently, our fish just aren't reaching as large of a size. And so this is lending itself to that idea that maybe these fish aren't getting as much food to eat as they once were. Okay, so this graph is showing, getting at this idea of the match-mismatch idea. So on the top, what we're looking at is our zooplankton biomass. And on the bottom, we're looking at our larval lake whitefish densities. And we're looking at them by cumulative growing degree days. And this is just a measure of kind of the number of sort of warmer days that these fish experience. So it's kind of influenced by both like time, the day of the year, as well as how warm those days are. So it's just a way to kind of compare across years. And so a couple of take-home messages here. So you see there's kind of like this window where after that time we see this zooplankton bloom. So this is where we see the peak of zooplankton occurring. But interestingly, so each of those lines is a different year, and I know it might be a little bit difficult to see, but basically some years what we're seeing is that there is no zooplankton bloom. So this is 2017 and 2021. We just don't really ever see that spike occur. And then the other thing is what you can maybe see here is that most of our larval fish are out there well before that zooplankton bloom is occurring. Okay, so after we do the larval fish sampling, we actually follow this up with some beach seining a little bit later in the season. So we kind of switch over once our catches in the larval fish program kind of reach zero. We then switch over and do some beach seining. This is also in the fishing islands. And this is being done to target kind of like post-larval age zero fish. Corey Brandt was talking about these fish the other day. And the idea is that these fish are using these beachy areas sort of like as nursery areas because they're productive. So we've been following up those larval fish surveys with the seining because we want to get an idea of whether these larval fish are actually surviving. And so this is some work that a biologist working with my group has done where Isaac's been looking at what the larval lake whitefish are eating and whether they're getting enough food to eat. And he's been looking specifically at this feeding success of these larval fish. So this is just a measure of like how much food and how successful these individual larval fish are at acquiring this food. And so this is just showing the mean feeding success of these larvae and how that then relates to how many of those age zero post-larval fish that we're seeing. And so we were really surprised when we saw this graph. Like we couldn't believe the linear relationship there, where those years where the larvae have more food in their stomach and they're more successful in acquiring that food, these are the years where we see more of those age zero fish. Also, if you just look at the numbers of empty stomachs of those fish, and these are specifically, we're looking at the non-yolk sac larval stomach contents, we see that 2021 and 2022, those 2 years, that's where we had fewer empty stomachs. So it seems like in years where, they're getting more to eat, there's fewer empty stomachs, these are the years where we're producing lots of age zero fish. And the other interesting thing here is you can see like it's pretty much linear. There's no asymptote at all in this relationship, which is kind of suggesting to me that we're not anywhere near kind of a carrying capacity or anything like that. Okay, and finally, I just wanted to show you a little bit of the results from the spatial comparison that we've been doing, looking at different locations around Lake Huron. And I'm going to share some of those results and compare them with Lake Simcoe, where we've been also doing some larval fish and plankton sampling. And Lake Simcoe offers an interesting contrast because this is a highly productive lake where there are dreissonid mussels. And we're starting to see some dreissonid mussel effects. However, lake whitefish recruitment is doing relatively well in this lake. And so I'm going to include it in this spatial comparison. So here what we're looking at is the larval lake whitefish density for these different locations around Lake Huron as well as Lake Simcoe for different years. And maybe what you can see right off the bat there is that we by far see our highest larval densities in that fishing island spawning shoal. And I've actually even truncated the axes and not showing the ones that are even further above that. But what the other notable trend here is that fishing islands is even above what we see in Lake Simcoe, which was kind of a surprise. As I said, like recruitment in Lake Simcoe is doing relatively okay. And then intermediate to that, we kind of see the Fathom 5, so that's just north of the fishing islands, and North Channel having fewer larval fish. And then by far the lowest larval fish densities that we're seeing are in southern Georgian Bay, which is where, recruitment is almost non-existent there currently. Okay, so in terms of the zooplankton prey availability in these areas, so here we kind of see the opposite trend where now fishing islands in the central main basin there, we're actually seeing the lowest biomass of our zooplankton populations. And the letters there, I should have said, just indicate whether there's a statistical difference between the individual years. And then we can see that Lake Simcoe is showing the highest amounts of zooplankton prey availability, which is not surprising, as I said, because it's such a productive system. And then interestingly, you can see that North Channel actually is fairly productive, relatively speaking, to other parts of Lake Huron. And then Nottawasaga Bay is kind of in the middle there. So lots of scope here for further investigating, that the association between larval fish, how much food is in their stomachs, how much food is out there for them to eat, their growth rates, and their survival. So lots to come on this work. Okay, so to wrap up, lake whitefish have been, profoundly influenced by the ecosystem changes that we're seeing, and this influence has occurred across multiple life stages. There's lots of other things that have been changing in the lake and effects on lake whitefish that I haven't spoken about, so I'm not trying to say this is all there is. But a key take-home message, I think, is that larval fish dynamics do matter, and they seem to be contributing to the declines in recruitment that we're seeing. So larval densities and larval growth rates have declined since dreissenids have been in the system. We see that potential for a mismatch between larvae and their zooplankton prey. We also saw that this low feeding success and fewer empty stomachs was linked to reduced survival. And then I didn't show a graph of this, but we actually have a really nice relationship between larval abundance and year class strength at age 4. So the larval densities, at least in the fishing islands, seem to be a good indicator of later year class strength. And then another interesting finding was that the fishing islands has the highest production of larval fish, but actually has the lowest zooplankton prey availability. And this is, one of the areas where we really have seen those recruits per spawner really plummet. And of course, we continue to have ongoing concerns about the sustainability of these whitefish populations. And with that, I'd just like to thank all of the many people involved in this work. So my research team, the Upper Great Lakes Management Unit, I've had a number of graduate students work on this. The Together Wikigoyak partners, Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, Parks Canada, and then funding for different results that I've shown throughout the slide today has been provided by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, Parks Canada, and the Canada-Ontario Agreement for Ecosystem Health. Thank you.